My name is Thomas, and for the last year, I've been a professional ghost. After my wife, Anna, died, the life drained out of me, leaving just a shell that went through the motions. I was a novelist whose words had turned to ash in my mouth, so I ran. I ran to the edge of the world, to the tiny, forgotten coastal town of Port Blossom. I was seeking solitude to nurse my grief, but what I found was a silence so profound it was a character in itself. The townspeople moved with a quiet, synchronized grace, their greetings polite, but their eyes guarded. I was a foreign object in their perfectly preserved ecosystem. My days were a monotonous rhythm of staring at a blank computer screen, walking the lonely stretch of Pebble Beach where the waves whispered secrets I couldn't understand, and making one pointless pilgrimage. Every morning, I'd walk the long gravel path from my rented cottage to the cluster of mailboxes at the end of the lane. It was a ritual of hope against experience. My box was always empty, save for the occasional pizza flyer, but beside it stood another box, a puzzle painted in faded sea blue. It belonged to the dilapidated, salt-worn house at the end of the lane, a house that sagged under the weight of its own emptiness. But there was a problem, a beautiful, maddening problem. The blue mailbox was never empty. It was tended to, visited, filled with a silent, secret language I couldn't decipher. The first time I saw it, I thought I was imagining things. I saw Mrs. Gable, a woman whose back was bent into a permanent question mark from a lifetime of tending her garden, hobble down the lane. She moved with the slow, deliberate pace of the tides. She didn't glance at my cottage. Her focus was entirely on the blue mailbox. With surprising reverence, she opened the small metal door and slipped in a scone, still warm enough that I could almost smell the cinnamon and butter from my window. She closed it with a soft click and walked away. The next day, it was Mr. Henderson, the gruff, burly owner of the hardware store, a man whose vocabulary seemed to consist solely of grunts and nods. I watched as he placed a small, exquisitely carved wooden boat inside no bigger than his thumb, its tiny sail perfect. He did it with a tenderness that seemed completely at odds with his rough exterior. And so it went. A different person every day. A ball of soft blue yarn from the women who ran the knitting shop. A perfectly ripe, sun-warmed tomato from a young farmer. A single, iridescent seashell, polished by the waves. It was a silent, daily procession. A rotating cast of characters from this quiet play, each performing their small, mysterious role. They were like birds, leaving offerings at a forgotten shrine. My writer's brain, dormant for so long, began to spark. This wasn't just a town, it was a conspiracy of kindness. I tried to investigate, subtly at first. At the local market, I complimented Mrs. Gable on her baking. "That scone you made yesterday looked wonderful," I said, trying to sound casual. Her friendly demeanor instantly vanished. A polite but impenetrable curtain dropped over her eyes. "It's an old family recipe," was all she said, before turning to help another customer. I tried with Mr. Henderson. I went to his store to buy a hammer I didn't need. "That's a fine bit of carving," I said, pointing to a decoy duck on his shelf. "You have a real talent." He stopped hammering, his gaze turning sharp and suspicious. "Just a hobby," he grunted, and then went back to his work. The conversation definitively over. Their collective silence was more intriguing than any story I could invent. They weren't being rude, they were being protective. They were guarding a secret with a fierce, quiet loyalty that I, the outsider, had no right to penetrate. The blue mailbox became my obsession. It was the only interesting plot point in my otherwise empty life. I started keeping a journal, not of my own thoughts, but of theirs. Tuesday, scone. Wednesday, boat. Thursday, tomato. It was a chronicle of unanswered questions. The gifts were never taken from the box by the person they were intended for. Instead, every 3 or 4 days, a different townsperson, never the same one twice in a row, would come, empty the contents into a wicker basket, and drive off in a cloud of dust. Where did the stories go? Then, one blustery afternoon, the pattern changed. A new character appeared. A young woman, maybe 30, stood at the blue mailbox. She wasn't leaving an offering. She was just there, her hand resting on its peeling paint, as if trying to draw warmth or comfort from the cold metal. Her shoulders shook with sobs she was trying, and failing, to suppress. She was dressed in city clothes that looked out of place against the wild coastal backdrop. Her pain was a raw, tangible thing, a stark contrast to the town's gentle mystery. My heart, a thing I thought had turned to stone, ached for her. The old me, the writer who saw stories in every stranger's face, would have gone to her. But grief is a jealous god. It makes you a coward. It makes you believe you have nothing left to offer. So I just watched from behind the safety of my window, a voyeur to a sorrow I felt but couldn't touch. After a long time, she wiped her face, took a deep, shuddering breath, and turned. But she didn't walk back towards town. She took the overgrown, almost hidden path that led to the empty blue house. My curiosity finally overpowered my inertia. I had to know. This was the inciting incident. I had to follow the character into the woods. I gave her a few minutes head start. Then I stepped onto the path. It was a tunnel of green, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and salt. Wildflowers grew in a riot of color, untamed and beautiful. The path ended at a small, weathered cottage. Its blue paint faded to the color of a hazy sky. It looked asleep, not abandoned. The young woman was sitting on the top porch step, looking out at the ocean. I stepped into the clearing. "Hello?" My voice sounded loud, intrusive. She jumped, her head snapping around. Her eyes were red-rimmed and defensive, braced for an attack. "I'm your neighbor," I said quickly, pointing back up the lane. "Thomas, I write. Or, I used to." A flicker of recognition. "The new tenant," she said, her voice raspy. "I'm Sarah. I'm sorry if I'm trespassing." "You're not," I said, sitting on a lower step. "But I have to ask, what is this place? What is the story of the blue mailbox?" She looked at me, a long, appraising look, and I think she saw the honest grief in my eyes and recognized it as a kindred spirit. And so, the dam of the town's secrecy finally broke. "This was my grandmother's house," she began. Her name was Ilara. As Sarah spoke, the ghost of Ilara began to take shape. She wasn't just a resident. She was Port Blossom's anchor, a retired librarian who had recommended the perfect book to every troubled teenager, who had delivered soup to every sick neighbor, who had officiated weddings and eulogized at funerals. She was the town's living history, its collective memory. 2 years ago, Sarah said, her voice dropping, the librarian began to lose her own books, a rare, cruel form of dementia. It took her memories first, then her words, then her recognition of us. She was now in a specialized care facility, 2 hours away, a stranger in her own mind. At first, everyone visited, Sarah explained. But our faces, the faces she had loved for decades, just caused her distress. Imagine being haunted by love you can no longer place. It was torture for her, and for us. The town was adrift, their North Star extinguished. They couldn't visit her, but they couldn't abandon her. The mailbox was Mrs. Gable's idea, Sarah said, a faint smile touching her lips. She said, "If Ilara can't remember the story, then we have to read it to her." The offerings weren't just gifts. They were sensory triggers. They were chapters. Mr. Henderson's little wooden boats were carved from the same type of driftwood Ilara's late husband used. The yarn was the same color she had used to knit Sarah's baby blanket. The tomato was from the vine she had helped the young farmer plant his first year. Every item was a whisper, a scent, a texture, a tangible piece of a memory she had lost. Sarah was the courier. She would gather the offerings, these little pieces of Ilara's life, and take them to the facility. "She has no idea who I am," Sarah said, fresh tears spilling. "She just sits by the window. But sometimes, when I place one of those polished seashells in her hand, her fingers will trace its curves, and she gets this look. It's not memory. It's more like a faint echo. And for a moment, just a moment, the storm in her eyes goes calm. It's the only peace she has." The sheer profound beauty of it left me breathless. This wasn't a town of secrets. It was a town of quiet, heroic love. They weren't just leaving scones and seashells. They were waging a war against forgetting. They were holding a vigil, sending signals of love into a fog they knew might never lift, simply on the faith that a flicker of light might get through. My own self-pity, my writer's block, my solitary grief. It all felt so small, so indulgent. I had locked myself in a prison of my own making, while this entire community had built a bridge of kindness out of the most fragile materials imaginable. I looked at Sarah, at the empty house full of memories, at the overgrown path that had become a road of love. The silence inside me, the one that had been screaming for a year, finally quieted. It was filled with the sound of ticking clocks and carving knives and gentle conversations. It was filled with a story much better than any I could have written on my own. The next morning, I didn't hesitate. I walked down the gravel path, past my own mailbox, and went straight to the blue one. My hands weren't empty. I carried a small, leather-bound notebook and my favorite fountain pen. I placed it inside. A silent offering, my story for hers. When Sarah came a few days later, she found it. She opened the cover, and on the first page, in my neatest script, I had written, "For Ilara, a place to keep the stories. My name is Thomas. I'm a writer, and I would be honored to help you." And from that day on, my own mailbox was no longer empty. Every morning, I would find a single, smooth white stone sitting inside. A silent message from a town that had finally let me in. What is the kindest story your neighborhood could tell?